Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my delight to welcome you to the Ukrainian Institute of America. I'm Kathy Nalivaiko, president of the board, and we're so pleased that all of you could join us for tonight's conversation. Today, February 24th, 2025, marks a solemn occasion, the 3-year anniversary of Russia's unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is a day of remembrance, resilience, and reflection. It also marks a dark moment in U.S.-Ukraine relations, as earlier today, the United States cast a vote at the United Nations that aligned with Russia rather than standing in solidarity with Ukraine. This makes tonight's discussion all the more urgent. Before we proceed, let us take a moment to honor those who have sacrificed their lives in the fight for freedom, in defense of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and in pursuit of the Ukrainian people's right to self-determination. Please join me in standing for a moment of silence. Thank you. We are honored to welcome two remarkable individuals to the Institute this evening, retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and journalist Greg Olear, both of whom embody fearlessness, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to truth. They are relentless in their pursuit of justice, uncompromising in their principles, and unafraid to challenge the powerful in defense of democracy. Alexander Vindman was born in Kiev, Ukraine, and immigrated to the United States with his family at a young age. He dedicated over 20 years to the U.S. Army, serving with distinction in various capacities. Notably, he was the director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia on the National Security Council. In this role, he provided critical insights into U.S. foreign policy toward Russia and Eastern Europe. A combat veteran of the Iraq War, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was awarded the Purple Heart after being wounded in action. He holds a master's degree from Harvard University in Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian Studies, and a Doctor of International Affairs from the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Hopkins. His expertise on Russia and Ukraine is unparalleled, and his steadfast advocacy for democratic values continues to shape the conversation on U.S. foreign policy. We are so thrilled that he and his publisher, Public Affairs, chose the Institute as the place to launch his new book, The Folly of Realism: How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. Available at bookstores tomorrow. You can purchase your signed copy here tonight after our program. Greg Olear is a best-selling author, investigative journalist, and political analyst known for his incisive reporting and sharp, unfiltered commentary. As the founder of Prevail, a widely read political newsletter and podcast, he has been at the forefront of exposing corruption, disinformation, and the erosion of democratic institutions. His work is marked by intellectual rigor, moral clarity, and a fearless commitment to holding power to account. If there are any other journalists here, I apologize, but I adore Greg, and he is my favorite journalist, so I'm thrilled that he's here along with Colonel Vindman. Together, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Mr. Olear exemplify what it means to stand for truth, even when doing so comes at great personal cost. Their shared dedication to exposing corruption, challenging authoritarianism, and defending democratic principles makes this conversation especially compelling and necessary. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
It's on me. Let's see. Thank you very much for having me here. Unfortunately, I guess the timing of this book release couldn't be better, unfortunately, because too much of this could be predicted, and we're 3 years into a disastrous war in which a key ally of the United States, a bulwark against naked aggression, is still engaged in high-intensity warfare with lots of civilians and military personnel dying on a daily basis. So it's a sad state of affairs, but I'm really proud to be able to launch this book here with the Ukraine Institute and frankly, like pull a quintessential Ukraine deal where you guys have access to the book before it's released. It doesn't come out until tomorrow, so that works out well. So my background, I think you heard some of it, but my family and I came from the Soviet Union, from Ukraine in 1979. Raised here in New York City, finishing up high school, went off to university, and then started a 22-year military career with postings all over the world. Somewhere down the way, the military gives you a little bit of say in what you want to do, and I became a foreign area officer. And then I decided that I think I could make a contribution based on my language, speaking Russian. The military trained me in Ukrainian, and then sent me off to Ukraine to live for a year, understand the importance of Ukraine to U.S. national security, the defense enterprises, the political relationship. In 3 years in Moscow, some advanced degrees, and then I went to the Pentagon, where I wrote the national security strategy, the Russia component of that strategy, and then I was asked to join the White House. And somewhere in there is, I guess, where I became a public figure, drawn into the public eye, because I exposed presidential corruption. I felt it an acute threat from a couple different perspectives. One, that Ukraine, already in a state of war from 2014, 5 years into a war, was being extorted for an investigation, and that this was a prelude to something bigger. I couldn't say I could foresee a full-scale conflict, at least not that early. Certainly, it was clear to me by 2021, but that this was a danger point, a flashpoint for a broader confrontation between Russia and the NATO alliance in the U.S., and frankly, shaking up the whole world order. And I also felt it acutely from a democratic standpoint, that President Trump, engaging in naked corruption, was attempting to steal free and fair elections, something that makes the U.S. What it is. Frankly, we've had a functional democracy with peaceful transitions of power, free and fair elections up until recently, and as an officer that had sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic, it was not something I was going to allow it to go unanswered on my watch. Eventually found my thank you. Eventually found myself on the outs with the Trump administration and compelled to end my career. I wanted to continue to pursue my understanding of the region, and undertook a doctoral program at Hopkins. Strangely, it was on an area where I'd spent quite a bit of time living in Russia and Ukraine, studying these areas in a significant amount of depth, and trying to understand how the relationship devolved. Trying to understand the complexity of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, how we ended up with a strange, peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union, but the cost of that independence was deferred by 24, 25 years, and the bill came due, and how these things evolved. So the Folly of Realism emerged out of an understanding and a study of the mistakes that occurred across 6 administrations. What we're seeing today is the most excessive, most extreme version of the mistakes that were made over the course of the preceding, I guess we're now in 2025, but over the preceding 24 years. There's a repeated pattern of the U.S. Catering to Russia, putting Russia first, a strange Russia first policy in which we felt like we needed to appease Russia, catering to hopes and fears, hopes that we could do more with them, that we could bring them into the fold as a democratic nation, that we could cooperate with them on a transactional basis and somehow normalize the relationship, or fears that if we had pushed too far, if we had supported Ukraine or supported the aspirations of the other independent republics, that was going to devolve into a second Cold War. Well, by accommodation, we ended up there anyway. So now the Trump administration is taking this folly. This reason it's called the folly realism is there's a kind of a, I'm going to say, bastardized version of a realism that's been carried out by the United States for certainly the past 30 years, where we believe that each country has their interests and maximally pursues those interests, and therefore we have to be maximally transactional with looking for wins, and that's what Trump is doing. He's doesn't have any care for history, doesn't understand what happened before. He doesn't even really take the lessons learned from his previous 4 years in office, and that there's really not that much to do with Russia, and is maximally transactional. So we are now seeing this unfold, this cult of realism unfold into the poison Kool-Aid phase, and that's poisoning our relationships with our allies and inviting aggression from our adversaries. And we're just now in this initial foray, but it's going to get very, very dangerous. And then I take some time to take a look at some other methodologies. What can we do better? And I focus in on an idea called neo-idealism. It's the idea of the centrality of values to interests. If we start thinking about what's really important to us, it's the relationships we have with democracies. They're the ones that are most stable. They're the ones where we have the most robust trade and the most fruitful economic relationships. They're the bedrock of our security architecture and NATO. And if we focus on these types, on the centrality of values to interests, we then start to think about not what's immediately in front of us, not highly transactional, but navigating around these bright, shiny objects to the things that really matter. Does that mean we sacrifice interests to values? No, that would be another kind of folly. But we bring the two into balance. We understand that we should be acting from a place of supporting hardening democracies, nurturing struggling democracies. Ours might be one of those, and then supporting democratic values around the world. This is what allows us to bring stability. And it seems like a pipe dream at the moment. But I think the extremes that we're swinging towards right now, this most extreme folly of realism, is going to require the pendulum to swing, as history tells us, in the opposite direction. And we're going to need some vision to march towards. And I think centrality of values to interests could become that vision in that distant future when we work our way out of a Trump administration. I think with that, I'd like to transition to questions.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I feel, very honored to be here in this very lovely building that is, I think, the nicest fourth floor walk up on the Upper East Side. And, for me, it's really, truly an honor to share the stage with you. I feel I want to say from people I know in my life, and I'm sure many people here, thank you for what you did. I think that the example that you showed of courage is something that a lot of people are going to have to take and use in the next 4 years or however long this lasts. And, I really thank you for doing that.
I might just riff off of that and say that what folks identify as courage was maybe a kind of a Brooklyn-esque type of irreverence. Who does this guy think he is, trying to get away with this BS on my watch? That's not going to happen. So
whatever it is, more of it. We need more of it in our politics for sure. So I have read your book and it's very good. I'm pleased to report. It is a kind of, just for people curious, it's a history of Ukraine. You spend a little time in the more ancient history, and then a lot of it is from the fall of the Soviet Union on. You talked already about the neo-idealism, which is the kind of more Wilsonian approach, as you say, the pendulum swing. And I don't want to give all the good stuff in the book away here, but maybe talk a little bit about, just so people have a sense of what it means. The Soviet Union falls. How would a neo-idealistic approach to politics have looked at that time, and how would it have been better? What would be different?
I'm not 100% sure it would be, that dramatically different. I think back then, what you have in the George H.W. Bush administration and very quickly in the Clinton administration is a recognition that there had to be investment into the region from a security standpoint and from a democratization economic standpoint. We faltered in certain areas. For instance, we had our own, we think back to that period of time, we had our own recession. So we didn't put the robust resources required to help transition these countries, both Russia and Ukraine, to, now you have a democracy. What does that mean? Does it come with prosperity? And the answer for a lot of people was no. It was a time of troubles. It was some dark days. So that might have been something that we were a little bit more thoughtful of, a Marshall type plan where we invested in that part of the world to help them transition. I could see the opposite justification for maybe not doing that. We'd engaged in 40 years of Cold War, spent enormous portions of our national wealth to fight the Soviet Union. Convincing somebody to spend resources into the Soviet Union was hard. So that's why I think it's a fine edge on what we could have done. We should have, if you talk to, I interviewed Clinton and Gore. Their aspiration was to help transform Russia and Ukraine, but they weren't able to bring the resources to bear. What they did do is that they focused on security, and what that called for is really partnering with Russia to help denuclearize the remaining republics. So Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, over 4,000 nuclear warheads. And the plan that they came up with is that Russia, the imperial center, was going to be part of this formula and collect up the nuclear and nuclear launch platforms, some of which are being used against Ukraine today, like the strategic bombers. And without the commensurate investments in Ukrainian security. So I think there were nuances, but to me, I've talked to the policymakers from that time, and to me, I could almost excuse their euphoria at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the potential that you could have pan-European security, that you could have all these dreams of Russia, Ukraine being drafted into the democratic world. But pretty quickly, you learn that that's actually not the way the Kremlin viewed the world. They were weak and not in a position to exercise power. Even internally in Russia, you had a very robust movement for autonomous regions. It looked at times like the Russian Federation was going to break apart, whether that's Chechnya, Tatarstan, which was right in the center of the country, one of the oldest holdings of the Russian Empire. Looked like they were at risk of spinning away, lots of nationalist movements. So I think the U.S. really doubled down on investing in avoiding the worst case scenarios. There's a portion of the book where I talk about something called the ungroup. Different reasons why it might be called that. One theory is that it was headed by undersecretaries. The other one was that it was supposed to be a cryptic reference to a group that wasn't supposed to exist. It was established in 1989 under the premise of the far-fetched notion of the Soviet Union. In 1989, the Berlin Wall goes down. Bob Gates convinces Bush, that we might need to start taking a look at the scenario. What happens if the Soviet Union falls apart? And as they look at this question, they focus in on specifically what happens if there's a nuclear proliferation, if you have loose nukes from the Soviet Union spilling out all across the world. So hyper-focused on security, really didn't pay that much heed to democracy or economic investment. So I think if we did something neo-idealist differently, it'd be doubling down on those relationships. By the time you get to the 2000s, no excuse. It's pretty clear where Russia's headed. It's pretty clear based on their support of genocide in the Balkans, their saber rattling in their own backyard, 2 Chechen wars. that this was not, things were not going to play out that way, and we still had blinders on, succumbing to these hopes and fears I was referencing.
I think you do a really good job in the book of balancing that and not saying, "Hey, you did this wrong." And you really give time to explain why they did what they did, because all this stuff is obviously very complicated and easy for me to sit here now and be like, "You should have done this." I think that's a very good part of the book. Most of the policy towards Russia at that time, as you say, was focused on nuclear containment and disarmament, and rightly so. Now, the threat of nuclear weapons still looms large as we deal with Putin now. We sort of stand back and watch him destroy stuff. And one of the reasons why we have been reluctant to move forward, as I understand it, is because he might launch a nuke someday because of his nuclear capability. I had Christopher Steele on my podcast. He said that he heard that China, Xi, basically told Putin, "You're not allowed to use nukes." I don't know if that's true, but that's what I heard. If that is true, how much now is this a viable threat, or is it just more an excuse for us to sit on our hands?
Yep. I think it's more the latter, but we should understand that we're talking about, cataclysmic events. So immediately policymakers think about not the probabilities, but the consequences. Even if it's, the probability hovers above zero, the cataclysmic event of a nuclear war with Russia really does add some quite a bit of sobriety to the decision makers. But what should counsel some resolve and some muscularity is that if you continue to bend to nuclear extortion, then that becomes the default tool.
Right.
And that's not just a message to the Russians that they could get away with whatever they want, but it's a message to other potential nuclear proliferators to build this magical weapon that insulates you from all consequences. So I think that the Biden administration, historically, we've always thought about Russia's nuclear arsenal first and foremost. But the Biden administration, when it was clear, Biden and President Obama, I'd say President Obama, it forestalled probably more fulsome support in 2014, this hope that he might be the one to fix this relationship and finally reset and normalize. We've had this pattern play out now. We're having it play out in front of our eyes now with Trump, but in the most appeasing manner possible. And then President Biden, once the war was clearly going to happen, I was engaging with the National Security Council pretty regularly. They had this group of kind of former seniors, and I wasn't that senior, but former cabinet secretaries and all generals and folks that they would bring in to discuss what's going on, what actions they could take. Generally, they did that to keep us on side, so like this we wouldn't be too critical. But they also did it to solicit some feedback. And there was no ambiguity in the kind of counsel I gave, which is this war is happening. This is the time to act. This is the time to signal sanctions. This is the time to provide support to Ukraine. This is the time to position troops in Europe. This may be the last opportunity to forestall Russia's aggression. And they didn't do that. They didn't want to be. The precipitating factor for things getting worse.
Yeah. On the Chicago Bulls in the 1990s, Michael Jordan was given special rules and privileges, and this was called the Jordan Rules. And I was thinking about this reading the book because, as you mentioned many times, the United States took a similar approach with Russia, with Gorbachev, with Yeltsin, with Putin, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia not held to the same standard as all of the other republics for a variety of reasons. Time and time again, we looked the other way when they did something singularly atrocious. And Putin has been doing really horrible things for a very long time now. But as far back as the Chechen War and the scorched earth, things that were happening there should have clued us in. Why do we keep doing this? Talk a little bit about that.
That's an interesting question as to why we keep doing it.
Speaking of folly.
Yeah. Why we keep repeating the same mistakes, and now, in the most extreme manner. Possibly because we didn't really conceive of alternatives. We think of the world, even though we're, again, up until recently, we have this very pluralistic notion, and we want to have good relationships with everybody, we still think of the world in spheres of influence and great powers. Realism, couches a particular type approach to great powers, that you're deferential potentially to great powers as regional hegemon. You want those to be good actors, but you'll take bad actors too, because they're fellow great powers and they're treated as exceptional. And Russia has been treated as exceptional for certainly the entirety of the 20th century, or the vast majority of the 20th century, and in the 21st century, we recognize Russia as the largest country in the world, the largest or second largest nuclear arsenal, a massive military, access to all sorts of resources and commodities, and we grant Russia the vision that it attempts to cast for itself, that it gets a unique place. And thinking about it differently looks unnatural to us. Now that Russia is clearly a bad actor, we should obviously change course. We didn't do that sufficiently under President Biden, and we're going in the exact opposite direction with Trump. So the only thing that I could think of that could potentially break through is Trump doesn't want Putin to be the winner. He wants Trump to be the winner. He will say that. He will say, I want Trump to be the winner, even though he's talking about himself. But so there's a way for his staff to indicate that there's a path to him being the winner, a path to him being a peacemaker. It's not by letting up on Russia. It's not by alleviating sanctions. It's by supporting our allies, supporting Ukraine, tipping the scales in Ukrainian favor, because the Russians are the ones that are uncompromising. So there's a way to couch this, and certainly you could see that battle playing out right now, actually, within the administration, when you have Secretary Hegseth in one moment saying that that Ukraine is going to have to give up its territory, that it won't be a part of NATO, and Trump validating that approach, and then 24 hours later saying we can't have Putin be the winner, but then 24 hours later reversing course again. So I mean, it's all over the place, but there's potentially, you could see that tension within the administration, folks trying to explain to the president what the consequences of some of these actions might be.
I mean, the problem with him is that even if there's an agreement, he's not going to abide by it. This has been
Which one?
I'll let you say.
No.
But there was a part in the book where you talk about one of the bilateral negotiations between the U.S. It was Boris Yeltsin. I can't remember if it was Bush or Clinton meeting with Yeltsin, something to do with Ukraine, and nobody from Ukraine was there. It was just these two countries. And of course, it reminded me of what happened in Riyadh, where we have, again, a meeting about the future of Ukraine with the Americans and the Russians and nobody else in the room. Now, the joking aside, this new administration is, I think chaotic is the word you use in the book. That's one word that describes it for sure. What did you make of that summit specifically, and all of this, and what does it portend?
So I think the epilogue was written on the 6th or 7th of November, right after. So it was before the inauguration, before we saw the nightmare unfold. Look, I look at things as from a national security lens. I try to not be overly emotionally invested into these things, although it's hard to kind of keep seeing that a train wreck unfold and screaming about it and not being able to do anything about it. But Riyadh, I actually didn't I didn't really think that much about it. The way I saw Riyadh was an effort to normalize. It was billed as a peace talks, but it wasn't. It was a means for the U.S. and Russia to look at a path to normalizing the relationships. I don't know why they build it that way, but certainly, there's not a substantive conversation without Ukraine or Europe in the room, because the Russians are going to do what they want. The Ukrainians will ultimately do what they want. I mean, they're willing to compromise as much as they can to achieve an end to the war, but they're not going to forsake sovereignty and independence. So again, you can't force peace down the Ukrainians' throat. The Russians want total capitulation. So this was more about, Trump visiting Moscow. This was more about, some starting some low-level conversations, or maybe not so low-level, rather than specifically about peace. The historical reference to the nuclear talks, and maybe it's a bit of a guide. What ended up happening in those conversations between the U.S. and Russia is that Ukraine wouldn't play ball. They weren't going to be sidelined when they had 4,000 nuclear weapons, and they needed something. They needed at least some security assurances and some economic investment in order to move forward on that. So eventually, Ukraine had to be brought into the fold. The great powers could talk all they want, but other countries have agency also.
Yeah, yeah. And then when I say things happen so quickly, I forget. Trump put out the statement on Truth Social, which is neither true nor social. This long, clustered thing with weird capitalizations like he does, basically taking the Kremlin party line about Ukraine and spewing it out to his however many weird followers he takes. And, what's the tactical advantage of that? What do you think he means by that? Is there any way to read that as anything other than capitulation?
It's interesting. I'd say he has a mode of operating where he could be a tough guy with small and medium states and bully and coerce, but he can't do that with large states. That is not effective. I mean, first of all, he doesn't get anywhere with it. He slaps tariffs on China. China slaps tariffs back on him. The Russians are not going to bend, without a great deal of coercion on what they think is absolutely essential. The reason that the Russians are fighting this war is they truly do not, the elites don't accept Ukraine as independent. Not because it isn't. Ukraine has had its own separate culture, identity, has been struggling against Russia. It's because it's key and central to Russia's conception of its own power. It needs this trifecta of Great Russia, Little Russia is how they refer to Ukraine, and Belarusians. So for them, the only way they'll give up is if they are coerced into doing so, and they're coerced from a position of weakness. Sanctions, the economy's teetering, economic victories on the part of military victories on the part of the Ukrainians. Right now, the Ukrainians are losing some territory, but at a very high cost to the Russians. But it's roughly evenly matched. At this pace, the Russians, it would take them some crazy number like 83 years to achieve to get to Western Ukraine. That's a silly sounding statistic, but it's just a snail's pace of advance. So pushing resources into Ukraine, helping Ukraine get the upper hand, not to maybe liberate all the territory, but to convince Russia that it's time to sue for peace, is the way you end this war, not by appeasing Putin. But again, Trump's technique is to believe that he could use some of his personal charisma. He's got some. He certainly has some over swaths of the American public, and that he could potentially use this, pandering, this appeasement to get Putin to compromise. That's not going to happen. So what we could end up seeing is somewhere down the road a scenario in which he doesn't get what he wants from Putin, but and in order to come out looking like he's a winner, then you could have a review of the Ukraine policy and maybe some rebuilding of bridges. But that's going to be some time.
May I speak briefly for the unwashed masses? Forgive me. I'm a lowly sergeant. I'm not an officer. Thank you so much for standing in the breach, Colonel Vindman. Thank you. What was the declaration? We signed today a declaration against Ukraine. Was that already covered?
We haven't talked about it, but what you're referring to is Ukraine forwarded or advanced a condemnation, a call on Russia to withdraw its military from Ukrainian territory, something that we've supported on probably a dozen occasions. And the U.S. sided with the Russians on this.
Not only that, but all other dictatorships, if I understand. Correct.
So, yeah, can we wait until the Q&A section?
Well, I thought that was it. He just,
No,
okay.
no, not yet.
Okay,
But
well,
thank you.
anyways.
I appreciate the question,
breaking
Sergeant.
rules.
Yeah, Sergeant, that's cool.
One of the things, and you talk about this in the book too, but I want to ask just point blank, why did Putin invade when he did? Because this is something that I've always asked people when they come on my podcast, because why not when Trump was president the first time? Why wait?
This is where I've tried to communicate this to the American public, and it really just, certain things are just too complex to break down. So the story is to me relatively straightforward. The reason that Putin waited is, first of all, he wanted to see the outcome of the 2020 elections. So part of that was seeing if he got a second Trump administration that breaks NATO and withdraws support, then you might not even have to have an invasion. You could, or you have a different kind of invasion where there is no support for Ukraine whatsoever, and then maybe the war unfolds in a different manner. So that to me, it crystal clearly explains why. Then you have a transition period with Biden. Biden potentially was supposed to be a foreign policy hand, and at times he signaled resolve, but really with little follow through. So you needed to test that relationship. He had to see how things unfolded. He had that meeting. Biden and Putin had that meeting in the summer of 21. And whether the U.S. was going to kind of put up or shut up with regard to support, we didn't. I'd say that some of the conditions in the United States were also absolutely critical. It is, to me, not coincidental that the buildup for this war starts in March of 2020, just months after the January 6th insurrection, where the U.S. looks fractured, weak, distracted. That over the course of that subsequent year, Trump continues with his narrative of damning Ukraine and applauding Russia, and that he actually drags the Republican Party in that direction. And as you get closer to 2022, it becomes evident that the Republicans, this was Putin's calculation, proved to be false because the Ukrainians held their ground. But from his perspective, the Republicans weren't going to be there to impose costs. If this is going to be that 72-hour war, and the Ukrainians were going to be subdued so quickly, one of the things you don't want is you don't want to deal with a blowback or sanctions. The movement of the Republican Party away from the Reagan roots, I think, was another kind of call. But fundamentally, there was not enough support for Ukraine. We didn't do enough to harden Ukraine over the preceding years or decades. And at the same time, they were still making significant progress. One of the reasons they performed so well is that they actually consolidated as a national identity, we're building an effective military. And Putin felt like time was not necessarily on his side. This was the time to strike. So he picked a moment where the U.S. looked weak and distracted. The Republicans were going to be there to impose costs, and in a closing window, which is oftentimes when folks act. It's when they know that time is short, and that's, I think, why he acted in 22.
Thank you. You allude to this in that answer and also in the book a bunch of times. The history of the United States and Ukraine seems to be something happens there that requires our immediate attention and urgent attention. And we're like, yeah, okay, we'll get to it eventually. And we I think day late, dollar short. I think you say that a couple times in the book. With Biden this time being just another example of that. We're afraid of offending Russia. We're afraid of a lot of different things. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, we assembled the coalition force. We kicked him out because it was against the Westphalian order for a sovereign nation to invade another sovereign nation. Right. Why didn't we do that with Crimea?
Nuclear exceptionalism, I think, is one of the biggest factors. Both Russian exceptionalism, which is different, that Russia has a unique place as one of the, maybe one of the poles in the multipolar world, or a great power of sorts, arguable, given their performance, the size of their economy, but still they get an exceptional place. And then I think the nuclear component is very, very overstated. what is clear to me in my interactions with the Russians at the highest level, I was in the chairman of the Joint Chiefs office when he's taking a call from. Well, I'll tell this story. So when Assad used chemical weapons against the civilian population, the U.S. decided to strike targets, Assad regime targets, and some of those targets were co-located with Russian troops, and we warned the Russians that missiles were coming, and then Gerasimov, the general, wanted to have a conversation with Chairman Dunford at the time, and I knew that these strikes were going to occur, and I was like, "Hey, boss, do I need to stick around? We have these missiles going in. Russians are right there." And they're like, "No, everything's fine." So anyway, I get home, don't even take my uniform off, and get a call back to come back to the Pentagon because now I'm translating a phone call between the two leaders of the military. And I might have broken some speed limits to get there in time. That the Russian chief of the general staff is waiting for me to show up, and then I proceed to translate this phone call, in which Gerasimov is attempting to warn off Dunford from conducting the strikes, and Dunford said, "These are going to happen. Get your folks to hunker down." And Gerasimov was like, "Well, if our troops get injured, we're going to have to respond." Is like, and Dunford is like, "Don't do that. You don't want to do that. We will defend ourselves." And then you could see all the air come out of Gerasimov, because they do not want this fight. They do not want a nuclear war with the U.S. They don't want a conventional war with the U.S. or NATO. They are full of bluster. They will say a lot of things to get the U.S. to self-deter, but they are deathly afraid of an outright confrontation. And it's not a surprise why. Look at how they're performing against Ukraine. They would be obliterated if they fought the United States and NATO. So it is overinflated, the reasons that we deter ourselves against Russia. If we acted with resolve years ago, we probably could have avoided some of the worst case scenarios that we're seeing unfold today.
It just feels like, to simplify everything, it's just a bunch of bullies, and somebody needs to stand up to the bullies, and then the bluster goes away. And it seems like that's not happening. Okay, so you read about the little green men in your book, and I'm reading the little green men, and maybe it's the word green, but I'm like, Trump isn't going to do this in Greenland, is he? Right? I'm crazy thinking that, right? Right?
Probably not.
Okay.
I don't know. Nothing is taken. No, I think that's highly unlikely. I think, again, there's a fair bit of bluster with Trump also. He could get away with a lot of stuff with small and medium countries, but I don't think he's interested in. I mean, the idea that we make enemies, not just sour relations with Europe and NATO, that wouldn't fly, because it's also the most important trading relationship we have. So I think that's probably okay, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he's looking to steal half of Ukraine's rare earths, because he's not going to get them from Greenland.
It's crazy. Oh my God. So I'm really frightened about Hegseth at the Department of Defense. He had this, Friday night massacre firing of generals and high ups. And as you tweeted, JAGs, which is ominous to say the least. And I am told that the new Joint Chiefs guy, Raisin Kane, which sounds like the villain from a Stallone movie, was known in Iraq as the Angel of Death, which, it's just what I heard. I don't know if it's true.
He's an Air Force guy. I'm not sure. The Air Force can't be angels of death.
Okay, good. I'm glad you. But what do you see happening there? And the main thing that I'm afraid of more than anything is that we're going to get into a situation where the military is going to be asked to do something illegal, such as occupy Manhattan or something. And he seems to be eliminating the guardrails and putting people in place that will impose those laws.
So he's absolutely looking for a free hand, no guardrails, completely unconstrained, wants to do whatever he wants whenever he wants to do it. And he's populating the executive branch, weaponizing the executive branch to where their executive branch is now becoming a malign actor. not all the good things that they do for us on a daily basis, not all the services they provide, but frankly, breaking things. So he's has every intention to do that, the same thing with the Department of Defense. But the Department of Defense is populated by the services, and the services are values driven. When you talk about the Army, that means loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. The other branches have a similar value set, and they're going to adhere to those value sets. Now, does that mean that they may be compelled to do awful things? Potentially. They're doing some sort of police work on the border, rounding up undocumented, illegal border folks crossing the border illegally. But crossing that bright line of illegal orders is not something that they're going to do. I mean, we're a ways away from that. It's possible that we could devolve to that state of affairs with enough Trump loyalists in there. I think one of the reasons that he replaced these judge advocate generals is because their role is to interpret the law. So he's looking for somebody that rubber stamps and interprets the law to take whatever are illegal orders and classify them as legal orders, and then force the military to comply. What's he doesn't necessarily realize, because he's not necessarily the most sophisticated actor, is that these 3 stars that were removed have 2-star deputies, and in the Army they have 5 1-stars, and then you go down to the individual installations, thousands. Maybe not thousands, but scores and scores of colonels, and you have captains all the way down at the brigade level. There are lots of attorneys, and he's going to have to go through a lot of folks, not just in the legal chain, but through the chain of command, to find those kind of blind loyalists and yes men. And with regards to Dan Kane, I've heard mixed reports. Some of my colleagues that have worked with him, including at the CIA, say that he's potentially stand up. My skepticism is that if Trump likes him, then there's something wrong.
Trump likes him because he said he put a MAGA hat on, and apparently he didn't put a MAGA hat on. So who knows? It might just be he's picked the wrong guy by mistake. We don't know.
Yeah.
So I have one more question, and then we can open it up to Q&A. There's 2 different things going on now as we sort of adjust. It's only been a month into the second term. Oh my God!
Long year.
Yeah. And it's crazy. But so we're watching all of this stuff domestically unfold, where there's lots of changes, there's lots of disorder, there's lots of people coming into to the FBI, to the intelligence community, et cetera. But domestically, we have a lot more guardrails. Internationally, the president has already and always has had vast latitude to do pretty much whatever, in many ways, to drive foreign policy. So he seems to love Putin and Xi and Kim and these dictators. What can we do collectively to change his mind? Is there anything that people can do to influence or, use our strength and our convictions and our voices to help drive it back towards democracy?
It's a tough one. I think the fact is that we have to, and the answer is yes, but it's going to be a slow process, and we're going to have to endure worse, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I think the fact is that swaths of the American population are disengaged, and they believed a snake oil salesman that said that he's going to make everything better on day one. That's not happening. Markets are not performing better. Inflation hasn't decreased, and these folks, especially the swaths of low information voters that have not been paying attention, that only kind of plugged in to the last week or two, those folks are going to wake up. And you could see some very, very early signs of that, with Republicans going back to their districts and being kind of beaten up. And popular sentiment can shift. Now, I think, there's some good research out there. Steve Levitsky from Harvard talks about the fact that we're moving towards something called competitive authoritarianism, which means we have elections that just tipped in the favor of the authoritarian. So that means we have to have, more turnout, more robust involvement. And I think that could happen, not just from the people in this room that are interested, because you're all here because you're interested. Not just from our compatriots that might be fighting for the Democratic Party and our Democrats, but really from the folks that are not plugged in, independents, still the moderate Republicans that are not paying attention, that believed the lies told about Harris or Trump about himself. So I think that process is going to play out, and I think we will see we should see a significant reversal for the Republican Party in 2026. If that doesn't happen, then I'm not sure if then things look a lot darker. But we have just about 2 years left. And I think there are other actors that will play parts. I think the military, I wouldn't count on them. They're not going to do illegal orders. Okay. But there's a lot of other things that could happen below that threshold. I think the courts are going to be absolutely essential. Everything is going to have to get adjudicated in the courts, grinding down, slowing down all these abuses. And I think the legislative branch may have some role too, like just with this firing of the military folks, the JAGs, and all those folks have to be confirmed again. Those 3 stars, the new chairman, the new chief of naval operations, new vice chief of staff of the Air Force, those are usually simple voice votes, up or down votes, unanimous consent type of thing, goes quickly. But if the Democrats insist on every single one of those folks getting a hearing and throwing some dirt into the gears, that means less mischief making on, let's say, judges or other things. So playing hardball is going to be critical too.
Thank you for answering that. I'm worried about the enforcement mechanism too. That's the thing that I'm really worried about.
Well,
Because the judges are going to do what they're going to do. Pam Bondi is now in charge, and Kash Patel of our enforcement.
You're absolutely right. We think about it as the executive branch, but it's really the implementing branch.
Yeah.
And if they don't implement, who's going to compel them to?
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, now we can take questions. Oh,
Thank you both. And particularly thank you, Alexander. My son reached out to you from Oxford when he was in a master's, Max Watson.
Of course.
And tremendous fan of yours. And he saw eye to eye with you on early intervention and support for Ukraine when we first realized that Russia was a paper tiger, did nothing. And so here we are. My question for you is about NATO. And it's one of my greatest concerns, is will this presidency coalesce our allies to stay strong in the face of Russia? Or are they going to cave? I mean, the current president claims victory when there is none, just as he did with Germany. And so is his influence going to impact the resolve of NATO, or will it strengthen it in favor of Ukraine?
I think it's going to strengthen European resolve. Certainly, the backbone of that resolve will be the eastern flank, Poland, the Baltics, the Nordic countries. They'll be there. Romania. I think the folks that have deep experience, Czechoslovakia, or I'm sorry, not Czechia. Sorry, thinking in historical terms. Czechia. I think they'll all be there. They've had that firsthand experience, and you could already see that countries are emerging as leaders to take on this mantle in absence of the U.S. That's France now relatively consistently, frankly, for well over a year. Macron's been leading this charge. The Germans have been arresting it, but they're with the CDU now coming in and likely Chancellor Merz pledging support, including providing long-range missiles to Ukraine. The UK also siding in with potentially sending in troops. I think the resolve is going to be there. I think it starts to get a little bit tricky if the U.S. starts to try to apply bilateral pressure to countries, like through trade, through other kinds of diplomatic pressure, whether they could start to chip away at that resolve. But I think, and security hasn't been forefront of mind for Europe. they've been happy as clams for a while, enjoying, at times being free riders and not sharing the burden of security. I think they're going to have to step up in a big way and rebalance their thinking about security. I think a lot of that's already happening. The new Secretary General Ruto's already talking about 3.5% of GDP from the contributing countries, well above that 2% that was discussed in 2014. 24 out of 32 countries already meet that threshold. So I think we're going to do better.
Thank you for that. I would agree, and it seems as though the United States is rendering itself obsolete in the world, and we're going to be replaced, and that's unfortunate for the world and for us. But thank you so very much.
Temporarily, I think.
Thank you very much. I repeat everybody else's thanks. You retired from the service, but you're still serving our country, so thank you very much. Comment, please, on the following. The good guys have a global economy, or part of the global economy, that exceeds 50%. And that includes not only Europe, North America, but also Japan, South Korea, of course, and Australia and New Zealand, of course. And they have a total of approximately 1 billion people. Russia has an economy about the size of New York City with about 140 million people. Our capacity, resources economically, militarily, exceeds Russia's. Further, we are not dependent on Russia for nothing. I don't have a frying pan in my kitchen made in Russia, but I do have a frying pan, unfortunately, from China, which I'm going to chuck. But other than the pressure that Russia had, the dependency on Russian energy, that's it. No ideals, no principles, nothing made, manufactured. How is it that for 2 decades, we have been essentially in a totally reactive, responsive mode, not taking the lead, and Russia has been the marauder, plus the fact that we have in Putin, he has the legacy and he admires Stalin with everything that Stalin represented. So how would you go about explaining that to anybody who's interested, even John Doe on the street, if he would even dare to ask a question like that?
I think I've attempted to try to explain it as we buy into Russian exceptionalism. We buy into this notion of Russian great power. They're relevant to us in certain areas when we talk about strategic stability and nuclear arms control. That's an area where we always figured out. We did something called delinking, to focus in on and make some headway on new START treaties and to reduce nuclear arsenals. They managed to convince different administrations of their vital role. George Bush, in particular, that the Russians could be a partner in fighting transnational terrorism. That was the bright shiny object for Bush at the time. Clearly a mirage, but it did effectively stay our criticism and conditionality around support to Ukraine. The threats, I think it does come down to a lot of these hopes and fears. There's some mystique about Russia that we haven't been able to cast aside. I think if we fundamentally understand the way you couched it, as they're, by landmass, they're something, but in all other measures of national power, they're really insignificant, and they've proven themselves to be such in the military sphere. So, maybe it's something to do with education. If we're better understand, what Russia is and isn't, we might stop this pattern of resets and normalization. But there's, every single administration that I've been a part of in one way or another, even lower down in the ranks, fancied itself as somehow managing breaking through and managing to make headway, and we haven't learned those lessons. Yeah, haven't learned.
We've never learned. Thank you.
There's a great book called Punishing Putin by Stephanie Baker, who's a reporter for Bloomberg, that talks about all of the way that we tried to wage financial war on Russia for the last 3 years. That kind of gets into some of the complexity and how hard it is to do that in practice. Anyway.
I'm going to jump in just very quickly. I'm sorry. And nothing personal, dear Victor. There are a lot of people that want to ask questions, so I ask you to be very brief if you can so that we can come through as many questions as possible.
Hi, I'm David Caldine from Fairfax, Virginia. And how would you assess the potential of the new Chancellor Wirtz to leverage his coalition government to provide security assistance to Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think some of those things are going to be easier, like the bright, shiny objects, like these Taurus long-range missile systems. I think that's moving forward. Germany has a very important industrial base. They've already made some investments. Rheinmetall, they're looking at partnerships on vehicle manufacturing, on artillery. I think some of those things are easier. But the problem that the Germans have is that they have a couple of different problems. One is that they've allowed their military industrial base to atrophy in a kind of, in a very, very terrible kind of way, where it's going to be a concerted effort to rebuild. They have this idea of, I forgot what it was called. They had a program to recapitalize the military. I'll remember the name here in a minute. And they've developed it under Olaf Scholz, but it didn't really manifest. I think it has an opportunity to do that under new leadership. They also have to contend with something that, this is where it gets a little bit more troubling. Their economy looks like it's slowing down. It is looking like it's less competitive. Productivity is decreasing. Can they afford to invest in their defense industrial base, support Ukraine, and re-energize the economy? So there are some challenges there. I think in the short term, I'm more optimistic whether they have the staying power based on the economic factors, and maybe some societal divides that occur as we get deeper into the new coalition government, and whether they have the staying power, that becomes more of a question. But I think in the short term, you could expect Germany to be there probably in a bigger way than they have been recently.
Thank you.
When you spoke,
Zeitenwelden, I think, is the name of the program. This recapitalization.
When you spoke earlier about Trump's motivation and talking about the kinds of steps or not steps that he's taking with regard to Russia, you spoke about technique, you spoke about charisma, and there have been many there have been many things written, and actually Greg's done a lot of this with one of his colleagues, LB, in terms of the history of the Russian influence on the Republican Party and the oligarchs like Semyon Mogilevich. And I wonder if you're speaking about Trump's motivation with regard to his handling of Russia now and then back during his first term, in not actually referencing some of the exposition that's been done, and not conspiracy theory, but actually documented background that suggests that the money coming from Russia and the oligarchs into the NRA and into the Republican Party and into actually helping Trump himself achieve getting the White House, long before a lot of people woke up to that fact, is something you disagree with, and that's... Excuse me? I thought I was pretty clear what I was going to finish the question. Thank you. Do you disagree with that assessment, and is that why you hadn't really gone into that as a motivation?
I think some of these things are in play. Thank you for the question. I think some of these things are in play. Certainly, Trump is highly transactional. If he sees a financial benefit, he will charge at it and seize it. I think that's been consistently the case with some of his engagement well before he got into, kind of national politics, trying to secure, property and build a Trump hotel or something there. I think some of these things are in play automatically because, again, I think Trump buys into exceptionalism. And for the longest time, I have a good appraisal of the influence that the Russians had on the 2016 election. They were marginal. We had other internal factors that were far more deterministic. That doesn't address the question of collusion. There was. It's just that the Russians didn't play, weren't critical there. But as I look at what's going on right now with the second Trump administration. I guess a lot of it could be explained by the fact that Trump really is enamored by authoritarians, is enamored by Putin, who's not been, it hasn't really proven himself to be a strongman, but there's some sort of affinity there. But I ask myself today, for instance, after this UN vote, why is he working so hard? Why is he working so hard on behalf of Putin? And I find myself questioning, is it enough that it's transactional? Is it enough that he's enamored by Putin? Is it enough that he's felt slighted by Ukraine? And I don't know. Because he's not really getting anything out of the relationship yet. Maybe he thinks this is a way to deliver this peace and the kinds of other wealth and benefits that he can get. But I don't know. It's just strange. I don't have a good answer for that one. But I'm not a conspiracy guy, so I the fact that they have compromising material, I'm not there yet.
So I'm going to jump in again, just because we pride ourselves here on being a very civil environment. We like openness, we like politeness, so we hope that all of us tonight keep that frame of mind. Thanks.
At the beginning of your introduction, you stated that you exposed the president's corruption. Who did you mean in first place, Biden or Trump? Thank you.
Do we have another question?
No, that's it.
Okay, then let's move on. I think I was pretty clear.
Not at all. But anyway, thank you for your answer.
Although I do accept some conspiracy theories and do wonder whether Trump is not an agent of Putin, I'll ask a different question in that, do you think that he thinks that this is a strategy to acquire, by siding up to Putin, that it is the way to acquire Ukraine's mineral rights, and that he thinks the victory will be in getting that?
I think that's potentially part of the deal. Russia's got a significantly larger economy than Ukraine, although what the U.S. Was looking to do is they were trying to get a down payment or kind of a loan shark type deal where it was $500 billion for the $100 billion in aid that the Biden administration provided. But then also somewhere in the ballpark of $18 trillion, they wanted half of Ukraine's rare earths, and that's estimated at somewhere around the ballpark of $37 trillion. So if that's the case there, it's bigger in Russia. I think it's some of the other factors I talked about with regards to his affinity for strong men, and he has this really strange, and I don't have deeper insight than necessarily people in this room, but he has this unique way of trying to, the places that he gets caught out, he tries to rewrite history, whether that's the insurrection on January 6th, and now he's trying to paint Russia as the good guy. Everybody else is wrong. That he will compel folks to see it his way. So it is part of his narcissism and egomania that he could do that. To the gentleman's question about Biden or Trump, I'm not aware of any any substantive claims that that President Biden engaged in any corrupt activities, whether his son did something unseemly and was accepting money from a Ukrainian oligarch. That's a different story. But there is nothing to indicate that no credible, that anybody that actually looks at the information will see that Biden was engaged. And I'm not a fan. You could hear. Well, I mean, I respect what he did for the U.S. With regards to some of the policies. I think he did some damage by not holding ground on the international front. But I'd say that when you stack the two up, Biden and Trump, I mean, the question itself seems absurd. So.
What is your vision about Trump's help Ukraine in field of energy? Because he talking too much of minerals.
Yeah.
We know minerals need big investment, and a refund from this investment maybe 10, 20 years. Trump will be goodbye, maybe
Yeah.
death.
Yeah. So
We have.
yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Every year I stay in Ukraine because I'm a green card and 6 months have right to stay in Ukraine. And I see what is problem with energy. My city, Lviv, all time used portable generator. It's very big problem. All energy infrastructure is destroyed. Now, this big guy Trump promised something wrong because he don't understand energy, must don't understand how working energy system, and the most important, United States is forever lost leadership in energy supply, in nuclear energy, because I'm nuclear engineer, I know that. Number one, China. China built in United Kingdom power plant cost for 4 cents per kilowatt hours. Now you pay maybe in New York 15, 20 cents per kilowatt hours.
Yeah.
Number two
Excuse
is
me.
Russia.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you. Maybe you can ask a question because there are a few more people.
How you explain vision of this?
Yeah, I think nuclear cooperation. We were moving in the direction of nuclear cooperation. Westinghouse was attempting to make some infrastructural investments. Of course, it's Westinghouse that provides the nuclear fuels for Ukraine. This would be a fruitful area of cooperation. When I went over there for President Zelensky's inauguration, one of the areas that we settled on that we were going to try to partner with Ukraine, maximally, was, and this is before the Ukraine scandal kicked off, so it derailed everything. But we were looking at potentially partnering on energy, and there's a lot to be said there. I mean, whether that's biofuels, whether that's wind, solar, all of these things Ukraine has made pretty significant investments in. At one point, it was providing some of the largest subsidies in the world, and it was garnering massive investments. A lot of that infrastructure has been wrecked because it's down south. But I think there's a lot to be said, especially about renewables. The legacy area of gas and oil, that's a tougher place for the U.S. to look, even though there were things we could do. And the reason is that those legacy sectors tend to be extremely corrupt, and it's hard to penetrate and partner. But I think there are opportunities long term. I think probably about 5 different sectors: agriculture, energy, transportation, aerospace, and and then IT. Those are areas where we should be looking to partner with Ukraine. We have to get past, the current chaos in the relationship through this war. But there are things that could be done. My cousin's also a nuclear engineer, so we talk about these things every now and then. From Ukraine, he worked at Chernobyl.
But again, Ukraine buy 2 used reactors, Russian reactors for Bulgaria.
Thank you very much.
Broken reactor.
Thank you. We have a next question. Дякую.
Thank you for your.
Yes.
Thank you. Colonel Vindman, forgive me for breaking the chain of command earlier. I'll stand down. So names like Tulsi Gabbard, Russia is pretty good at infiltration. Am I correct? What do you think about that? That's all I have to say.
Yeah. So I think that her judgment is clearly compromised based on her meetings with Putin and Assad. And for her own political gains, she was willing to do or say anything to garner attention. I think in her role as ODNI, it's troubling, but it's one of those things that could be cauterized. What it means is that we just our allies cut us off and they don't share their most sensitive information because they have questions about whether she's compromised and they want to protect sources and methods. It's very, very unfortunate. It actually puts the nation in harm's way because we're not going to get potentially the most fulsome support. But it's a consequence of Tulsi Gabbard potentially being in that position. As to whether I'll let folks that have kind of dived into this into the question of whether she's compromised comment on that one. I don't have I guess I don't have anything substantive to add there, but I just know the consequences are that we'll lose access to intelligence.
she's in a cult, too.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
other. That's the other part.
The other part.
I'm not sure
Yeah.
if the cult and the Kremlin, if it's the same handler or two different people. We're
Yeah.
not. No, I'm joking.
Good question.
I'm sure a lot of experienced federal employees are quitting or taking early retirement because they don't believe in the current administration. They're totally set against it. Is it better for them to stay put where they are? Couldn't they do more good staying in place as opposed to leaving and not being able to affect the government inside?
Gosh, I hope they don't leave. I think they should stay on and try to do their jobs. It's a tough call, frankly. I think, just in my own decisions about whether to join the Trump White House, I was cautious. I talked to a bunch of folks and tried to figure out if I could do good, because I knew seemingly my views with what needed to happen to secure the United States were at odds with the president. He ultimately signed a national security strategy that I helped draft that suggested that he would on paper that he was going to help advance U.S. national security interests. And when that proved to be false, I still thought I could do some good in even more limited roles, because at some point after I reported the corruption, I ended up being a target of retaliation. I think when you are the focal point like that, it becomes really hard. But if you're generally working inside government, providing services to the American public, that is an awesome responsibility, and I would encourage those folks to stay there. It's a question of when their values come in conflict with what they're directed to do. That's when it becomes a challenge, and that's when folks tend to resign and protest. But just to leave because they don't agree with the president when they have an important job to do, I would counsel against that, because we need good people to stay in position and continue to hold the line and protect institutions and provide services to the American public.
Assuming, unfortunately, that NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine, at least in the short term, what do you think an alternative security guarantee for Ukraine could look like? Does Europe have the capacity and the will to be a sufficient deterrent against Russia? Thank you.
I think Europe does have the resources. We're still talking about somewhere in the ballpark of 18 to $20 trillion economy. So economically speaking, they have the resources to really significantly increase their defense industrial base and defend themselves and extend defense and deterrence to Ukraine, if that's a way to settle this conflict. There are probably not. I mean, the ultimate security guarantee is Ukraine and NATO. That's off the table with the Trump administration. So for the foreseeable future, I think Europeans potentially putting forces in Ukraine also significantly ratchet up the risks for Putin in a way that he doesn't want. He would like to pick off European countries, break the lines, try to shift to bilateral relations, bilateral coercion. That's where he has lots of tools against the Baltics or even Poland or something like that. But the Europeans united, that's a high bar, and I don't think he would perform that well. Now, the Europeans have a lot of work to do to in the absence of U.S. presence and resolve to rebuild some deterrence and defense to further warn them off. But I think that's not a fight that Putin is interested in having, at least not in the near future. Maybe down the road, 4 or 5 years.
Thank you.
Two quick questions. Thank you, first of all, for your continued moral stance on Ukraine. And first quick question is, given the atrocities Ukrainian people are experiencing on a daily basis, was it a mistake to give up the third largest arsenal of nuclear warheads? Yes or no?
So if you, that's one of the things I talk about. I basically look at critical moments in the U.S. relationship with Russia and Ukraine. I look at independence. I look at denuclearization. I looked at the Orange Revolution, 2014, 22. And one of the things that in my interview set that becomes clear to me is that the that the Ukrainians couldn't necessarily sustain a nuclear arsenal. They didn't have access to, the weaponized material that they would need to sustain a cycle, to sustain a nuclear program, especially as weapons were being achieving expiration. And I talked to some of the principal authorities that worked on nuclear. So I think when the Ukrainians were looking at this question, it wasn't whether they keep a nuclear arsenal, it's what can they trade an arsenal that they potentially can't manage anyway in exchange for. And the best that they could manage was security assurances, which turned out to be meaningless, and some financial support. So I don't think it's entirely fair to say that the Ukrainians could have retained it. One of the first things they gave up was that the things that they could most readily employ. The tactical nuclear weapons were the first things to go over to be transferred over to Russia. And then when you get to the strategic arsenal, that's something that requires a lot more maintenance. Now, the Ukrainians built a lot of the systems, the delivery systems, but in terms of the warheads themselves, that was not a capacity that they had. So it's not quite as simple as should they have given it up. I'm not sure if they felt like they had that much of a choice, and they were aspiring to join Europe. In their view, they wanted to try to get maximum benefit from giving up something that would be highly costly anyway.
Oh, just to jump in there, that was a particularly good chapter in the book. So everybody should buy the book and read the chapter.
Perfect. Thank you.
One more quick
no,
question.
I'm sorry. But it's always difficult to be the bad guy, but I think that we will wrap it up here. We will have an opportunity upstairs if you join us at the reception to have more dialogue and discussion. And I would ask you now to join me in a round of applause for our guests.